The aircraft will then come down to land like aircraft do. Passengers can walk off like you do. Freight can be loaded on and unloaded like you'd want to in a part of the world that's disconnected from a port. Most importantly, you can turn the airplane around for its next flight quickly and be making money again.
How do you see your relationship with Helium evolving over time?
When I talk emotionally about what we're doing in the UK, it's because I see the power of what we're doing to create something new for the next generation.
We've seen very little progress in decarbonisation. Why do you think that is?
In aircraft design, manufacture, certification, support, operations, we've got the lot. You reach that point where it's ready to go to market and all that governance side just drops away in one go. So we can do some of the things other aircraft can't. For passengers, it's really good because it means that we can't squeeze you in 3 abreast with a seat there in front of you. It just doesn't work, right? So you're going to get more space. When I step back from that and say, well, look, put your business hat on, does this make sense? The answer is
Hi, I'm Chris Caldwell, and welcome to Season 3 of Conversations on Climate. So, welcome to London Business School, and to the first of our series on the future of flight. Now, before I pass over to our wonderful guest, Tom Grundy, we'd like to kind of quickly set the scene of really asking the question of why the future of flight matters. So to start with, we're going to have 9 billion passengers flying in our skies this year. So COVID's well behind us, and that number is only growing, and it will continue to grow pretty much exponentially over the next few years. Now, why can't we just be doing the same things that we have done over and over again? Well, I'll be asking Tom to be answering that question. It's a little bit unenviable. But what I'd like to talk about are briefly 3 of the fundamental drivers in behind this, what are shaping the industry. First is climate, second is deglobalization, and third is seemingly low levels of innovation that we're finding. Now, the obvious one, climate change. If you're listening to our kind of politicians doing their various debates over recent days, you'd be forgiven for thinking that climate change isn't happening. You know, it's all a myth. But believe me, outside of the UK, people are talking about this stuff. It is really a big global movement, and the transformation is ongoing. We need to remake and remodel the global economy. We need to be doing it incredibly quickly, in 20 odd years, and that is absolutely totally unprecedented. Now, looking at the role that aviation is playing, historically, we haven't exactly been friends to the planet. So 2.5% of all emissions are from the aviation industry, but if you look at it a different way and take in non-carbon emissions, we're up to more like 3.5%. So if you add in contrails and the rest. Now, if you were taking that 3.5% and translating it into a country, that would be the 5th largest country in the world. In terms of emissions. That's somewhere between Japan and Russia. That's a pretty big deal. You may ask whether it's fair to be putting aviation into the bucket as if it were a country. I'd say it probably is, because as a quirk of kind of carbon calculations, countries individually don't count their aviation emissions. It's a quirk. So you need to count it somewhere. We may as well count it as a country itself. And this number is only growing. By 2030, some studies say it could triple. I think that would be just mind-blowing amounts of people flying out there. And so you're potentially getting to 10% of global emissions by 2050. So what can we do about it? Well, first thing, could we be getting more efficiencies? Well, since the 1970s, we have increased the fuel efficiency by about 75% in our normal kind of traditional aircraft. So probably not. We think we squeezed that out about as much as we can. Is technology going to save us? Well, electrification in the sky, far more difficult on the grounds. So yeah, we know. I'm sure Tom will talk about that later. Sustainable aviation fuels, actually quite possible, and the maths aren't insane. You can. Some studies show that you can be making flights with sustainable aviation fuels with only a 20% increase in the ticket prices, which to me seems kind of reasonable. But there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of kind of political will or pressure in behind it. And the third is, I'll touch on again later, but most of our innovation tends to be looking towards space. Is that the best use of our engineering genius, trying to get a few billionaires up into the space? I'm not entirely sure it is. Second big issue is deglobalization. Why is deglobalization a question? Well, it's because globalization and the aviation industry have been very kind of firm bedfellows. They've gone hand in hand. As the world has opened up, aviation's opened up. As flights have become cheaper, more reliable, more quicker, then it's opened up the world. So globalization and aviation have been growing very synergistically. And actually, it's a case study of a well globalized industry. So we've had centralization, we've had hub and spoke, we've had just in time, we've had increased standardization, reducing costs, we've had consolidation. Big cities have essentially become the toll booths of the world. So is this the sustainable model? I don't think so, because COVID has come and has shown us that these things are more fragile. We have climates, as mentioned before, and they get geopolitics, which are kind of fracturing world orders. So COVID has taught us that individual countries can be shutting down the system. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown us that, again, individual countries have got, and geopolitics can have an impact. 35 different countries have prevented Russian flag carriers from flying across their space. Russia has retaliated. So there's big chunks of the world where you don't have where are essentially no fly zones. Now that on some flights has added a couple of hours, added an extra 20% in fuels. So a combination of COVID and geopolitics is showing that globalization is having an issue on aviation. Now, demand is still growing, so where do we go from here? So to get ahead of these trends, we need to be looking at kind of less centralized systems, less homogenized systems, more local systems. So are these markers a sign of the times for what's coming? Well, perhaps. So maybe we need to be kind of getting ahead of these trends from globalization, from deglobalization and from COVID, and start to form new systems which are less centralized, less homogenized, and more local. And also, when we're going into newer markets, can we possibly be leapfrogging and not having to build in the old systems of the past? Then we're on to the third of the big themes that are shaping this industry, the need for new thinking. Now, great problems do require great solutions, and as Peter Thiel once famously said, we were promised flying cars, and what we got was social media. Now, maybe he was a little bit premature in that statement, because as things are moving on, I think there's a realization that, particularly for the future of flight and aviation, a new app isn't going to be solving things. We need to be getting more into the kind of nuts and bolts. So we need to get into the physical and need to be making engineering cool again. Now, to do that, we're going to need support from governments, we're going to need support for the financial systems, and we're in a really tough macroeconomic environment. Now, I'm curious to know how Tom is planning on dealing with all of these thorny issues, but thankfully for me, I'm the person who gets to ask him all these big questions after this presentation. So without any further ado, I'd like to pass over to my guest for this morning, Tom Grundy, and he will be the main event for today. So please, Tom, welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for coming to talk about this really important topic, I think, of how we see flight changing, what we've got used to in the past, how that might be different in the future, and really, frankly, from my perspective, how it needs to be quite different in the future in many different ways. And you've talked about some of the themes and some of the trends there, Christopher, and I'll unpack some of those as we go through the conversation. But let me just start with a little bit of background to me. This is the product that I work on. We'll talk Airlander. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. And as far as the person stood in front of you is concerned, that's sort of me. So I was the kid that got into aviation because of one trip. I grew up in the west of the UK, in a very rural part of Britain. Wasn't a lot of flying going on. As a child of the 70s, at the age of 2 or 3, I was taken abroad to the US by my parents to meet family and actually, as it turned out, to expand horizons. that one trip, the next time I flew actually after that, so that was the age of 3, the next time I flew I was 18, and I was at university doing flight test engineering training on that second flight. And so that real start point for me led me to this world of exploration and development of different technologies in aviation. And across the career I've built since then, I've worked on products like Eurofighter Typhoon, all the way through to small unpiloted aircraft designed to get to places that other aircraft can't get to. I ran the program that put the big winglets on the end of Airbus wings that you'll see on the end of those wings now as you fly around in most of their products to most of the places. Flown airplanes in difficult and hot and sandy parts of the world to develop them and test them. And I've also run services. So I spent 3 years running the support programs for the Tornado aircraft for the MOD and the RAF here in the UK. Really worked to get more efficiency out of those aeroplanes. So I've been lucky enough to run the gamut from taking technologies off the page and into flight test, all the way through to making them really perform in service. And so that package of experience, turns out it served me very well in developing this product, Airlander, something completely different. I think for me at the time when I joined the company, and for many people slightly out of left field, many people at this point in conversations are wondering what something like that, what role that's got to play in the future of aviation, how it fits alongside the other things that we see and we understand and that are normal around us. And that's really some of what I want to talk about this morning. The topic is the future of flight, the changing face of the future of air transport. And I actually tend to use this picture because it's a much more holistic view of transport as a whole. And it really does separate itself into 2 domains. We've got fast aircraft at the top left, relatively energy intensive, relatively smaller, more expensive to operate, quite an exquisite product actually in many ways. We don't always think that when we get on board the aeroplane to head off on our holidays. But it's a very, very fast product there. And then across, and it needs to be, by the way. So it's fast, that's very convenient for us. But actually, if you think about how you generate lift, you need to be going fast to do it. So it's both form and function, right, the speed of aviation. And then across the rest of the picture, we've got road, rail, shipping. These things deal with bulk really well. They need infrastructure. They're a little bit slower point to point, but the economics of that surface transport is really very different, a much lower price point, generally a much lower emissions intensity, certainly in operations, and actually quite a big gap between those 2 spaces. There's some physics behind why that gap exists, but the best way to think about it is there's not much in the world that's traveling between 100 kilometers an hour and 200 or 300 kilometers an hour. That speed gap, we don't have anything that matches the efficiency of surface transport on the one hand, which kind of tops out at 100 kilometers an hour or so, a little bit more perhaps, and aircraft which take over at sort of 300 kilometers an hour and onwards, right? So we've got that gap there, which is a feature that we're addressing and exploiting with our product, and I'll come back to that later. But my real question, actually, when we look at this picture is the face of air transport really changing? And if it is it changing fast enough? So if we look around us, the things that we know are going on, that efficiency improvement that we've seen in jet transport that you alluded to, I think 75% is probably a pretty good estimate since jets came along in the 1950s. That's a 2% year-on-year steady reduction that's delivered that. We do see that continuing, actually. There are some programs that are going to probably keep driving that 2% for a while. There's a question about whether that curve's going to flatten, but there is a little bit more to go out there. But we've got growth at 4.5–5% a year. So we're creating the efficiencies, but we've been using those efficiencies and more in driving growth, driving costs down, passengers up, growth in the market. So there's efficiency driving into the aircraft side of that through that picture. I've just lost my clicker for a minute. We've got some interesting things going on with supersonic transport, next generation of supersonic transport coming along. We can probably have a long debate about whether that plays into the sustainability agenda or not. It certainly plays into the getting there fast agenda. And air taxis, eVTOLs, a lot of interest in sort of 4 or 5 seat electric passenger aircraft. And broadly, that's the picture on the aviation side. Obviously, we've got a little bit to say about what we might add into that, and I'll come back to that in a while. But that picture leads us to charts like this. So this is one of many industry trajectories, industry roadmaps that you'd be able to find around you. This one is from the UK, but you'll find other ones that deal with the global picture. They all look pretty much the same. What you've got, obviously, is time across the bottom there. And then the emissions forecast for the sector against a baseline and against various scenarios. And the top line there is what happens if you let that 4.5% growth happen. Right. So our emissions in the sector are going up and up, driven by the growth of the industry. But that's not the only thing that's happening, right? So we also know that aviation's probably going to get a little bit more expensive for the passenger. So the first block there, that 14% block at the top there, says, well, okay, more expensive aviation, we're going to have slightly less growth. We know that we can improve the way we use airspace. We can, stop these hold patterns, reduce the queues, get better routing in flight, get electric tugs on the ground rather than having fuel-burning tugs on the ground for the aircraft. That's another few percent. And then we have the light blue block, which is where the 2% year on year comes in. So that's airlines buying new aircraft, more fuel-efficient aircraft. 16% is the one I'm most interested in. That's where technology plays. New aircraft types. What are we going to do differently? So 16% of that emissions reduction is forecast at the moment to come from new aircraft types, including hydrogen and electric aeroplanes. And then at the bottom, the orange and the pink, this is, the orange and the green. This is where sustainable fuels step in and where offsetting steps in. So green broadly is the airline industry's offsetting program, and orange, 39%, 40% of the job, sustainable aviation fuels. So that gets us to net zero by 2050, which is what we need to do. So that's okay, isn't it?
Simple.
I won't quite end there. The industry doesn't think so. So the question there, are we making progress at the rate we need to reach net zero by 2050? 94% of people said no. The industry in question is the aviation industry, and the audience being polled was broadly aerospace engineering professionals. This was at Farnborough Summit held earlier on this year. So the industry experts in the room are saying the roadmap is interesting, but we're not making the progress we need. So this is a difficult job, certainly say those people, I'd agree. And I'm just going to spend a couple of slides just unpacking why it's difficult. So the first thing to say is we use a lot of energy. Right? It's back of an envelope calculation, my own, so please test it, check it, and just quietly write to me if I've got it wrong. But I think it's about right. We're using about as much energy in a given day flying people around the world as the human race are eating in that same day. Okay. So that puts the energy question into perspective. Now, look, other sectors use more energy, but this is contextually gives you a feel for the size of the challenge that we need to meet when we say we're going to swap a different fuel in, or when we're going to do something different. And for flying, it's all about energy density. It's about how much energy can you pack into a small space. And for that, for any of the flying that we know and generally do today as passengers, certainly, batteries and electric, there isn't going to be a Tesla here that takes you on holiday to the Mediterranean. Airbus's CTO a few years ago said, look, if we have batteries that are 30 times better than today's, they'd be just about good enough to carry half of the number of passengers, 1/5 of the distance as our current kerosene-fueled aircraft. So batteries really, there's some niches, but batteries aren't going to scale, not based on the technology trends that we see around us now. Hydrogen has got some significant promise. It's more energy dense. It actually, in terms of the energy per unit mass, it takes up a bit more volume to store it. Those different properties mean we're probably going to need new aircraft types to exploit hydrogen. So really at the early stages, there are some companies out there doing great work looking to retrofit existing aircraft. That will get us started, but existing aircraft have been designed for the properties of kerosene. If we're designing for hydrogen, we're going to need to go down different paths. There's a different aircraft will look different because the physics of the fuel that they're carrying looks different. And that brings all sorts of industry questions into mind. We're in a duopoly situation in aviation. We've got Airbus and Boeing in the aerospace world. They're big. They've got big order books for kerosene-fueled aircraft. That transition to a new fuel, that can transition to a completely new aircraft type. We all know from dynamics of disruptive industries, there's some quite hard barriers of incumbency there to overcome for the two players that are in the market right now. And so there's a question here about how much disruption do we need, how much regulation do we need, how much are the companies going to do themselves to move ourselves through to hydrogen. The next reason it's hard is, as you said, Christopher, the CO2 emissions are not the only part of the story. Yep, about 2.5% of global emissions comes from aviation right now. That can be 8% or more in a developed country, and I'll talk a little bit more why that is in a minute. But the kicker is that carbon dioxide is doing more damage by being emitted in the stratosphere rather than at ground level. And the contrails that are behind the aircraft, they're a big deal. We're only just really working out how big. And there's quite a wide range of estimates around how big that might be. But certainly I think we're standardizing around you can at least take the CO2 impact and double it for the accounting for contrails, other emissions in the high atmosphere, other things that are going on as aircraft come along. The contrails are really interesting because they probably do all of their warming within about 3 days, right, whereas CO2 does its warming over 100 years. So if we can get rid of the contrails, we actually make a big step quite quickly. And then the third thing that I think makes this hard is equality. So the top 10% of flyers account for 45% of the emissions in this industry. About 8 out of 10 people around the world haven't got on an aeroplane yet. So we're using those same number of calories, the same number of joules that we're using to feed ourselves as a population, and we're allocating them to quite a small sector of society here. And it's the same in freight. About 1% of freight travels by air. Now, just to bring that home to you, you can see the Our World in Data chart there basically says that the richest half of the world is emitting about 90% of the emissions from aviation. The rest of the world accounts for about 10%. I kind of was trying to unpack what that meant personally. I did some more back of the envelope calculations about a year ago, and I figured out my carbon footprint in my life is about 10 tons a year. It's about double the global average. Trying to get that down, but at 10 tons a year, I had about 3 years to get to net zero before I ran out of my personal budget under the climate accord, Paris Climate Accords, right? If I took one long haul flight, I knocked 7 months off that 3 years, right? So it's a big driver of for those of us that fly, it's a really big driver of our personal consumption of CO2. Same if you go to a vegetarian diet to minimize your impact on the climate, for example, vegetarian or vegan, watch out for the air freight, because the carbon embodied in the air freighted goods, that's a significant piece of your carbon budget there. So I think that frames the problem a little bit more. Some of the solutions then, SAF, which the industry, sustainable aviation fuels, the industry is depending on here as a transition. And you can see how dependent it is. This is far too small to read any of the detail, but this is from Up Partners, who do an annual report on mobility. Their report this year is a great read. It covers all aspects of mobility. This little light blue section here, 1% today, which is, as I'll say in a minute, is a little bit of an overestimate. It's actually 1% in 2025. They're saying that needs to be 65% of the fuel that we're using in aviation by 2050. It's a big scale up. Actually, where we are today is 0.1% of the aviation fuel that's used today is sustainable aviation fuel. So just watch out for the claims that SAF today can significantly reduce footprints in flight, because it doesn't today. Overall, we've got 0.1% of our fuel sources are SAF. 99.9% of what we're using is kerosene, straight from the refinery. Moving to SAF, the Royal Society did some work that said last year, which showed that for SAF to sustainable aviation fuels, biofuels, to deliver what we need for UK aviation, so departures and domestic from the UK and domestic travel in the UK, we will need half of the UK's available agricultural land to produce the feedstocks to do that job. If we go instead for what's called e-fuels, or power to liquid, we take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we synthesize it with hydrogen that's been electrolyzed and create jet fuel that way, we need 5 to 8 times the 2020 total of our sustainable energy generation capacity in the UK just for that job. Okay, so it can be done, but it's energy intensive. Then there's some other pieces that we just need to think about opportunity costs and displacement effects. So in terms of opportunity costs, choosing to use that energy for SAF to go into aircraft would have a lesser benefit than choosing to put that energy into fuels and into industrial uses that aren't about flying. So we can make a bigger impact on CO2 if we divert those fuels elsewhere. And depending on the feedstock, if we get into land use changes to generate that SAF, then we can really be going backwards rather than going forwards, as we've seen with palm oil and other things. There's some real care points here around SAF. It's important, we need to use it. I don't argue with that at all, but we just need to test the way we're going about it so we don't create some really negative outcomes by accident on the way through. The other thing to remember is it still emits CO2. So it helps us, but it doesn't get us there. This chart shows where money's going, private money, to solve these problems. Sustainable fuel there, at the bottom right-hand side, $760 million of private investment. It is dwarfed by what's going into things like eVTOLs. So eVTOLs, as it says there, have secured twice as much private sector funding as the rest of sustainable aviation technologies altogether. So there's some real interesting challenges and questions, I think, for policymakers in and around this, is how do we incentivize and promote the right flows of capital to the right solutions to really make a difference to this problem. And just to pull out some other things here, electric aircraft and battery electric aircraft, $1 billion have gone into there. I would say that we're probably not allocating our capital very efficiently here as a society if our drive is to get emissions out of aviation. We sit there, my company sits there within that hydrogen aircraft block. We've taken about $170, $180 million of that block to develop our product to the point that we have today. So my view, when you look at all of that, big chunk of SAF in that industry forecast, some real challenges with how we scale that up. The real benefits of aviation that we want to preserve for society. My view as an aerospace engineer is that we need to do better. We can't just rely on a transition to a different fuel type to drop into what we've always done to get us to where we want to be. So, of course, as a society, we'll do as much of that as we can to buy ourselves time, but we need to be doing better for the future. And we're in a little bit of a race between tipping points, I think, given that equality piece. We need to tip ourselves towards those new solutions before societal opinion and social license to operate starts to tip in the other direction and start to hold us back. And again, as an aerospace engineer, I have forerunners that developed the jet engine, that developed commercial air transport, that scaled it up to what it is today, put all the infrastructure in around us and caused us to have this system that we rely on and love. Of course we can do better. Of course we can solve these challenges. Of course we can design for hydrogen and other fuels to make this work. But of course, when we're disrupting, when we're changing, sometimes that change and disruption comes from unexpected places. It comes from forms that you didn't quite think of when you started. And I think we need to open our eyes to that breadth of opportunity. We're not always going to be hooked to the tube and wings that we see around us today. They've been designed and developed for a very good reason, which is they were designed to use kerosene. We're going to be moving away from that. We're going to see different things. So I think we need a little bit of a shift of the debate from incrementalism to disruption. I think we need to change the perception that SAF is going to dominate, sustainable aviation fuels are going to dominate, and that's where the transition is going to come from. I think we need to be driving proper investment in other technologies, including hydrogen as a fuel. And I think we need to do that with the confidence that the analysis that's around us says a hydrogen aircraft can deal with long-range aviation challenges. It's a better use of energy to synthesize hydrogen than it is to take that hydrogen and add it to complex other chains of molecules to deliver a complex fuel. We need the bravery to understand and weigh off the costs in a trajectory that sees an aircraft fleet replaced over time versus the costs of scaling up industrial infrastructure to produce biofuels. Those trade-offs, I think, really need to be front of mind. And then with the right decisions, we can intelligently deploy our innovations to solve different parts of that aviation picture. So, to our contribution to that particular challenge. Back to this picture, very simply, we're putting an aeroplane in that gap there. It's designed to operate in that speed gap, 100 to 200 kilometers an hour, where high-speed rail actually operates, where you can get the railway line in. It's the same sort of speed, it's the same sort of proposition. More scale, bigger payloads, lower costs, lower emissions, and in that gap, there's a range of jobs that aircraft can do that at the moment we're being really inefficient in the way we deploy them. We've either got inventory, excess inventory tied up in long overland journeys, or we've got aircraft doing short sector jobs that aircraft aren't really optimized to do and emitting a lot of carbon in the meantime. So we're here really to pioneer zero emissions aircraft. We're getting to zero with ours. And we're doing it in a way that creates a better connected tomorrow. This aeroplane doesn't need to work from runways. It doesn't need to work from today's airfields. It can do the sort of jobs like deploying energy infrastructure out into remote parts of the world that are quite challenging to do right now, because right now you need to build a runway to get them there, and a whole package of other things besides. To do that, you can see the shape of the aeroplane there. We're blending technologies from fixed wing aviation and from airships together with different forms of propulsion to create sustainable aircraft with those unique capabilities. And we expect that to unlock something which we think of as a new category of transport. So larger and more fuel efficient, lower impact than airplanes, faster than traveling by land and sea, capable of operating away from fixed infrastructure, for large-scale, advanced regional air mobility, also for logistics and for freight, and also for some long-endurance flights, whether that's for ecotourism or whether that's for surveillance, protecting people, looking after borders, doing search and rescue, those sort of jobs. We, in the time we've been working to develop Airlander, have developed technology. We've gone through a process of getting that technology matched to market demands across an aggregated civil and defence market, and we've started to build order book. So today, our just under $2 billion of reservations for aircraft include Air Nostrum, which is Europe's largest regional airline, who will be flying 100 passengers at a time in Airlander aircraft between cities in Spain, across to the islands in the Mediterranean, around the islands in the Mediterranean, and more broadly across the Mediterranean to places like Malta. That is a big decarbonisation play for a regional airline. Closer to home in Scotland, we're working to do the same, but this time for passengers and for freight. So the mobility challenges up there are acute. They're acute for people. They're acute for the families that want to see each other, for the people that need to get to hospital appointments. But they're also acute for business, which is reliant on ferries to get its product in and out of products in and out of the islands. And this is a great example of how bringing a new category in can unlock business opportunity for regions, whether that's in agriculture on the one hand, or whether that's in electricity generation, sustainable electricity generation from wind turbine farms and those sort of things on the other. And alongside customers like this in the civil sector, we're working with the US Department of Defense in the US and BAE Systems in the UK on defense applications for the product as well. We've brought a big team of partners together to that programme over the time we've been doing it. We have AECOM, world's biggest infrastructure service, one of the world's biggest infrastructure services firms with us, BA Systems, I've already mentioned. 2XL Aviation run VIP air services and also security type operations from their fleet of aircraft. Dassault Systems in France, Collins and Raytheon, together with institutions like the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, who are helping us develop the production line that will see aircraft like this operating as they come out of the door of their hangars. And I just want to sort of finish really with what this project means for the UK, what it means in terms of getting to a point where we export this green aircraft out around the world. I'm pretty passionate about the everyday wonders that aviation delivers. I'm not coming at this from a point of view that we need to regulate air transport out because of its harms. I think we can do better. I think we can achieve zero with the right drive. And that fits with my career, those different pictures that you saw on the first chart. I've always been on a mission to get aircraft doing more, doing better, doing it at low cost in all of those different jobs that I've done. They've not been incremental development jobs. They've generally been things that have been disruptive and transformative. And that certainly chimes with what I'm doing here. It's also taught me that our abilities here in the UK to innovate and lead in aerospace, we're one of the very few countries in the world that are really capable of doing that all the way through the life cycle. And as a result, aerospace is one of the pillars of our national economic well-being. It's a big industry, it's a big exporting industry for this country. And along with all those good business reasons, I'm kind of determined that future versions of me, that picture you saw on slide 1, a young person from the back of beyond who was inspired into a career in aircraft, can find their inspiration as well in delivering a path to net zero, because we need that, and we need those people in here, in the industry, working to do it with us. So our current mission is to step up production of Airlander, 24 aircraft a year in South Yorkshire in the UK. And this is what a green aerospace manufacturing site will look like up there. It will employ 1,200 people in South Yorkshire, near Doncaster, in a place called Carcroft Common. We've agreed terms on that site. We're in the process of moving our way through planning to the planning process to get to the point where we can start building this facility. And our aims are to get 24 aircraft a year out of that facility by 2029, be delivering just about 1.5 billion a year of export revenues from that work, and to use that platform to drive and lead the path to hydrogen in aerospace. We're going to be one of the first adopters. Our very first aeroplanes won't be hydrogen fueled. They will still use kerosene, unfortunately, but will be 75% better than anything else in terms of emissions at that point. The very next step for us is hydrogen fueling electric engines. So look, it's a really optimistic project. This is about creating better connections for a more sustainable future, not just delivering the same connections with a bit less CO2. It's practical. It's something we can do here and now, and in doing it, we can blaze a trail for technologies like hydrogen that the rest of aerospace, I think, can come along and follow. And it's really valuable. It's valuable for the people in South Yorkshire, for the jobs that it brings. It's valuable for the UK in domestic connectivity and in exports. And it's really valuable for the world because we can take some of these parts of the challenge, decarbonise those quickly, and I think more importantly, show that different ways of doing it can work. So thank you very much for listening, and I think I've got some questions coming.
Yeah, of course you do. Thanks very much, Tom. Well, Tom, thank you so much for that presentation. They've certainly filled in an awful lot of the blanks in my understanding of it. It's much appreciated, and some fascinating and quite terrifying stats that came out of it. But before we kind of dig into a little bit further into the details, would you mind kind of going a little bit into your own kind of your past and your background? You described like a broad experience in the aviation industry, but like in 2013 you decided to leave the more kind of mainstream and go into alternative flight and low carbon. Like what attracted you to go into that particular space?
That wasn't a particularly difficult decision, actually. I certainly didn't see it as a step out of the mainstream. Mm-hmm. And I guess my perspective on that is I've always been an integrator in each of those different jobs. My role was to pull together expertise from various different domains, initially engineering domains and disciplines, and to facilitate a process and a conversation that allowed us to optimize a product. Right? In my case, aircraft, and we had lots of different engineers around the table, and as a 29-year-old chief engineer, what did I know? Right? The only thing I knew was how to facilitate those conversations and trade off the different benefits and disbenefits that each of those different disciplines can bring to the table. And I, applied that trade and scaled it through many jobs in BAE, and was really lucky that was always at the whole aircraft level. Right. So I wasn't ever really designing pieces, we were optimizing the whole. And that's a fascinating challenge. And generally you're doing that for a reason, right? You want to get the aircraft to go somewhere it can't go before. You want to access a market you couldn't access previously. You want to get costs down, or whatever it is, there's a function there that you're driving. These skills are exactly what I had the opportunity to deploy in HAV with Airlander. The difference was, as I'd gone through my career in BAE and Airbus, which are phenomenal companies for any engineer to join, any person to join, great development, great learning, great projects. And I'd been building in different parts of the business landscape into what I was doing. It was only really when I went to HAV that I could join all that together. How does the flow of capital, how do your decision making around how you optimize the operation of the business, how does that all flow down into what you can do within the company? As to decarbonisation, I will tell you, I remember on day one, my interview going into BAE, I talked about the importance of the aerospace industry getting ahead of the curve on getting emissions down and telling the story of how we're going to do that. So I can realistically claim to have gone back to 1999 with that part of me coming to the table. So again, the whole fit there with what we're doing in Airlander, there's no better project to be working on in the UK than this.
Great, yeah, I did it well before it was cool. Yeah. So, and it looks, absolutely gorgeous. I know there've been a few test flights. Have you been up on one yourself? And how does it feel like? What's the difference? Yeah.
I don't get to go on the test flights. It's a really unfortunate part of test flying is you're regulated on who goes on board. So the test pilots get that fun. So not for me yet, but you won't keep me off it at the very first opportunity. I can tell you a bit about what it feels like to be on board though, because I've talked to them. And the thing that comes out straight away is the view. We're going to talk a lot about the business, right? But let's talk about emotion and passion just for a minute. This is, look at it. We've happened to have left a good picture on the screen here, right? Floor to ceiling windows, we can do that because the aircraft flies slower. Those windows can open. You can get a view of the outside world, you can get some fresh air. This is like being on a train, it's not like being on an aeroplane. It's quiet. Anybody who's been around that aircraft, our prototype aircraft, to say a couple of things. One is it's huge. The other is it's alive. It's quiet, it's got systems running, it whirs along, it breathes, it moves gently in the breeze, a bit like a ship at an anchor. And so that quietness, that ability to be going above the landscape at the same sort of heights that you see helicopters fly at rather than the sort of 30, 40,000 feet that jet airlines fly at, these bring a whole different feel to the experience. Now, that's very interesting, right? If that's all that was about, we would take a lot of hot air balloon flights for that. But combining that with a product that's got practical applications, connects people, connects places, gets you to things that are really left behind by our current system, and does it in a sustainable way, generates a lot of passion in the people that work on the project.
Yeah, I'm sure. And so, kind of leaning into then the kind of the decarbonisation issues, there's been, like you say, since 1999, maybe not before, I think you're one of the innovators, but certainly for a long time, there have been a lot of conversations going on about how to decarbonise the aviation industry in general. Two things, there hasn't been very much innovation full stop. We've had supersonic, but not a lot really else. And we've seen very little progress in decarbonisation. Why do you think that is?
Well, I actually think you'd talk to a lot of people who would say, well, actually, there's a huge amount of innovation going on within aerospace. I think they'd very correctly say that consistently driving 2% year on year efficiency improvements in these exquisite machines where you've got metals and materials operating beyond their natural melting point. These are extraordinary innovations that have been happening here to drive that forward. The objective function of that innovation has been a little bit different. Right? Really, we've been looking for fuel efficiency to get costs down, to create growth and create great opportunities for people. Yeah. So there's a lot of innovation been following that path. What we haven't had, I think, is the recognition that net zero, I think it's as simple as this. You can't be partly sustainable, right? If you're sustainable, it sustains. There's no end. Right? If you're a bit better, well, there's still an end. You've just pushed it out a little bit. And we had this moment in 2020 as an industry, I think, when suddenly 70% of the world's fleet was grounded. And suddenly all the things that we took for granted, we went through a step change. And I saw the narrative change. I'm not saying people weren't thinking about this before, right? But the importance and the potential for our society to say, stop. That was quite a moment. Right? So I think what we're now seeing is a recognition that we might need to do things differently. But here's where I think we get it wrong. Yeah, it's hard, but nobody wants to hear it's hard. It's got to be done. Yeah. And so I think you're then into a question of how does society organise itself so that that difficult challenge gets met? And I think, personally, from that point, you look out at examples of where industries have been disrupted. We are in an industry in aerospace. Aviation, airlines is highly disaggregated. It's pretty much buy lease an aeroplane, lease a crew, and you can start an airline. Aerospace, on the other hand, that is a duopoly. It's a duopoly for a reason. We've consolidated the industry to get the efficiencies that we've driven for, to get the outputs that we want. It's strategic. It's tied up with national security. We've got order books for aircraft that will still be in service well beyond 2050. Right? So that's the system that we're talking about when we say we might need some disruptive change in there. I think that's going to mean regulation, industry, disruption, mandates, different ways of thinking to get us there. But that's a big topic.
Yeah, and the extra layer of infrastructure there that you're up against is not just the airlines and the infrastructure to build competing planes. It's also the airports and even the psychological and the emotive barriers that we all have. We all feel we need to be going to airports, we need to be doing all these things. How do you kind of see the challenge of that sort of the sticky infrastructure that's attached to those more physical on the ground?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I kind of have a few different perspectives on that, right? One is that infrastructure's grown up for a reason. It's grown up quite fast, actually. If you go back to where jet aircraft started, you didn't have air bridges and all these systems and everything. We've done all that because there's a business case there to drive efficiency for passengers getting onto jets and going flying, right? So we've invested in that over time because it's a good thing to do. We've done it around an industry that's consolidated its route network because I think of the physics of kerosene. You've got a high energy fuel in machinery that needs to be big to make really efficient use of that fuel. That means you need long runways. It means you need lots of security. It means all the things that we wrap around. And we then put that package together and call it an airport. And we happily charge people for going through it and buying things on the way through, and the airlines for taking off and landing from, and so on. It doesn't have to be that way. It probably will be that way in lots of sectors of aviation for a long time. It doesn't mean that something different can't exist. We've got railway stations, we've got ferry terminals, we've got heliports, we've got places that helicopters go and land nowhere near an airport. We do all of these things. So we're talking about taking that little bit of what we do and applying that to a different category. And there's a business case to do it. That's the key, isn't it? The other part that I think about your infrastructure question is don't forget the hidden infrastructure. Right? So we've just talked about sustainable aviation fuels becoming 50, 60, 70%. What you do look at different route maps, and they'll give you different numbers, but they're all big. That's a lot of infrastructure investment. Why are we still at 0.1% sustainable aviation fuel now when the target originally was to be at 10% by 2020? We've not invested in that infrastructure to scale that up. Why haven't we done that? Well, kerosene's very cheap. It's largely untaxed, actually. You'll pay much more when you go and fill up your car at a filling station than the airline will pay when they fill up a airline. And set against that, you've got sustainable fuels which are going to come into the market. We think, I may not get this number exactly right, but somewhere around 6 to 8 times the price. So that's not going to happen, is it, without mandates or subsidies or some kind of forcing function.
No, indeed. And your technology is, in some sense, is a kind of like Back to the Future. You know, it's an existing technology. It's been around for a while, but this isn't something that's completely unprecedented. Like the first, EV, electric vehicle, was like 100 years. Invented 100 years ago, and wind turbines have been around for literally thousands of years. But what are the kind of the marketing issues that you have in and around with introducing an old technology as a new solution?
Yeah, those are great examples actually, where things that were in our blind spot that we could have done all along, now the economy, the environment, governance suggests these are now good things to promote and bring forward. And it's also needed people who have been prepared to be right out the front of that. So we can sit here now and say, well, all the conditions were right for EV and wind turbine, but you remember all the battles at every step along the way about how this wasn't going to happen and we couldn't make the change. Yeah. So good examples. Ours is similar. It's slightly different. There's one twist on it. What we do is we combine technologies from airships and from fixed wing aviation. What that means in practice is we've got a lifting body. Our whole aircraft is shaped like a wing. So about 40% of the lift that Airlander develops is from aerodynamics. It comes from moving the aircraft forward through the air. The remaining 60%, we fill that wing with a lifting gas, helium, and that gives us that 60% of lift. That gives us a head start against gravity. It's why the aircraft's so efficient, even before we choose what engines and fuel type to put in. For that reason, we don't call it an airship. And let me just unpack the differences. Airships float, that's the obvious thing. They should work, shouldn't they? You know, boats work, they float on the water, it doesn't cost you any money to keep them floating there, so it's a very efficient way of moving things around. Why doesn't that work for airships? The problem with an airship when it floats is you really want to put something on the ground. So you've floated across somewhere very efficiently to drop a 50-ton load off onto the ground. You put that 50-ton load onto the ground and all of a sudden you've got 50 tons worth of too much lift wanting to take that airship up and float away and escape from you. That's a problem. That needs infrastructure, it needs people. More than anything else, it needs time. And time drives down asset utilization. It undermines the operating cost advantage that you should theoretically get from floating. Okay. Right? So with Airlander, we come down and land. Because 40% of our lift comes from aerodynamics, we can turn that off just by turning the engines off. The aircraft will then come down to land like aircraft do. Passengers can walk off like you do. Freight can be loaded on and unloaded like you'd want to in a part of the world that's disconnected from a port. Most importantly, you can turn the airplane round for its next flight quickly and be making money again. Yeah. So these are the differences of a hybrid compared to an airship. I think they're really so fundamental because they drive the operating economic case for the airline. It's got to make money out of the asset.
Yeah, well said. But you also mentioned helium there. Helium is perhaps the least renewable element on this planet. It's like every little bit of helium that we've had is the one element that escapes the atmosphere. Like it's unique in that way. And I've seen there's maybe only about 50 years left of helium for us to be able to extract, and it's mainly as a byproduct from the extraction of natural gas. These are long-term assets and long-term solutions, and with that type of dynamic, you expect pricing to be going up. How do you see your relationship with helium evolving over time?
Well, there's 50 years of known reserves out there, and the US Geological Survey estimates there's many tens of years after that, just not found, because we know the sorts of places, we know the sorts of rock formations that allow helium to be captured, trapped, and then extracted. It's a funny thing, isn't it? We can see helium being made all the time. It's just up there. It's not down here. So in terms of what's happening on Earth, you're right to say that it's both finite and when released into the atmosphere, it will escape into space. The thing for us is Airlander, at the biggest fleet sizes that we project, would use around about 1% of the global annual usage of helium. Mm-hmm. Right? So catastrophic success for what we're doing here is 1% of annual usage. So we're not really going to move the needle on those timescales, is really what I'm saying. We do see price fluctuation. There's all sorts of global dynamics on the supply side, actually, rather than it's not as far back as extraction. It's actually in the dynamics of how helium gets released onto the market is why sometimes you can't get a party balloon, right? But the 99% of helium that's being used for other stuff like medical scanning and supercooling of any scientific instrument that needs supercooling, and a lot of it's used in the space industry, and a huge amount's used in the diving industry. Those commercial uses, you can always get supply, the price fluctuates a little bit. The advantage with Airlander is once the helium goes in, by design it stays in. It is small, some of it does escape. So part of the annual maintenance cycle is to put a little bit in each year. But in operation, you're not throwing it out the back of the aeroplane. It's not like a fuel, so it doesn't really feature very heavily in our operating cost stack up. So look, I mean, there are other paths for the future. There are paths that have been used in the past. I'm not interested in those right now, because what we can do here with helium is build ourselves at least 50 years, and US Geological Service has many beyond that, of practical operating service with a lifting gas that we know how to certify, we know how to operate with. We'll be putting hydrogen on board, but we're putting hydrogen on board for fuel rather than for lift for the time being.
Great. And you talked earlier on about your, was actually an enormous sense of pride that you were setting up manufacturing in the UK, and it seemed to be something that you very much wanted to do, which is wonderful to see. And setting up in Doncaster as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But the general kind of the mood music around manufacturing in the UK is pretty bleak. It's pretty dark. Are we being too harsh on ourselves?
Yeah,
we are.
Yeah. I think we have got. So look, the UK is a service-based economy, but if you and I think that's actually true right across the United Kingdom, isn't it? But let's look at South Yorkshire. You've got an area there that was largely deindustrialised in the 80s and the early 90s. And that's turned itself round on the back of advanced manufacturing as the core of its offer. So anybody that wants to know something about the importance of manufacturing to places and to people and to the economy, I strongly recommend you go and see the people at the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre in Rotherham in South Yorkshire. And when you go there, remember that you will be on the site of the Orgreave Coking Works, where the Battle of Orgreave in 1984, I think it was, happened, which was the seminal moment in the miners' strike and the deindustrialisation of that sector of our economy. It is now a beacon of growth. You've got the advanced manufacturing facility in and of itself. You've got Rolls-Royce, you've got McLaren, you've got the only European manufacturing facility for Boeing, all grown up around that nucleus. More than that, we're seeing in the UK the start of devolution into the regions. The mayoral combined authorities now have got the mandate for growth plans and investment plans for their region. And in South Yorkshire, Mayor Oliver Coppard has set out his plan for growth, which really tightly makes the case for prosperity and pride for people being grounded in advanced manufacturing industry current and the heritage that area's got in the past, and it's a powerful thing. So those, when I'm talk emotionally about what we're doing in the UK, it's because I see the power of what we're doing to create something new for the next generation coming through schools and colleges and apprentice colleges in that area. When I step back from that and say, well, look, put your business hat on, does this make sense? The answer is absolutely it does. It goes back to what I said about the UK's skills in aircraft design, manufacture, certification, support, operations. We've got the lot. Right? The jewel in the crown is integration. It's important for the regulator and it's important for all the industrial players. An aircraft is one of the most tightly coupled packages of technology that we have in our world. We get on them all day, every day, but they're miracles. Right? So integrating all those different disciplines and domains into that and getting it right and getting it certified, there's not many places that have got all that joined up. We're one of them. Mm-hmm. And with that skill set and with the regulatory part of that in the CAA being able to bring a first of type aircraft through a regulatory process in the right way and get it out and industry to get it out into service, this is why we're doing it here in the UK. We've got the skills, we've got the capabilities, we've got the heritage, and the grass isn't actually greener in many other places.
Fantastic. One of the biggest and actually least discussed challenges the UK is facing at the minute is the ever-expanding trade deficit. And you setting up manufacturing facilities here, and immediately becoming an exporter of very, very significant infrastructure is a great step in the right direction. You mentioned regional government powers being put into regional authorities as one of moving things forward to be trying to help with the UK manufacturing system. Any other changes you would like to see that to help to promote UK manufacturing and export?
Look, I'm not a policy person on the manufacturing side, right? On any side, right? But here's what I would say is the hidden benefits of manufacturing are huge. Make UK have just put a publication out a couple of months ago that really articulated the primary and secondary benefits of manufacturing to the UK and to economies in general. And I think we're not quite good enough at believing that. That's how I put it. Why do I say that? Well, let's take a couple of different examples. If you're a software house, if you're in fintech or something, to some extent, if you're in pharma or biotech, right, you can develop a product in the UK that's come through a research and development system that's really brilliant. It's genuinely world-class, I think, in terms of its ability to filter, select, sort. Yeah, we need to connect up with the Horizon program again. Yes, we need that broader collaboration. But the ecosystem here of working out what to invest in, what drops away at different times, what makes it through, that really works, right? But in policy terms, by the time we get to the point we're ready to commercialise, that R&D grant-funded support drops away. Typically, you see companies or products come through with maybe 1-to-1 intervention ratio. So grant funding puts in £1, private investment puts in £1. You reach that point where it's ready to go to market, and all that government side just drops away in one go. Some sectors have got special deals that allow that transition to happen. But my point is, if you're in software, if you're in services, it doesn't really matter, right? Because you're there, you've got the technology developed, you're ready to go. If you're in manufacturing, that's really hard because you get just to the point where you need to scale up industrial landscape, industrial architecture, do the thing that Elon Musk said, manufacturing is only 100 times worse than, harder than research and development. It's only 100 times, right? But this is the point where you need a little bit of help. And at the moment, I think our policy environment is a little bit weighted towards the things that we do really well in the Golden Triangle, we do really well in pockets around the UK. But if you're looking at reindustrialising, if you're looking at taking this massive opportunity of a hardware revolution, which is what the net zero transition is going to be, you need some intervention at the point of commercialisation. And I think that's something that government needs to think about.
Yeah, no, we'd love to talk to you for a lot longer on government policy and reindustrialisation, but just being kind of conscious of time, I want to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. Maybe if we kind of go into just a couple of kind of closing thoughts and closing ideas. Would like to get to kind of to talk about your reflections on kind of leadership and education. So it's quite rare these days to find someone who is like in heart, soul, and spirit an engineer as CEO of a business. How has your kind of identity and your education as an engineer helped you kind of reshape the team that you're building within HFE?
It's an interesting question. I think as an engineer running a business, the first thing you have to remember is you don't set out to optimize everything. You know, the classic example of tweaking the last little bit, that doesn't work, right? But it's been a very steady transition for me. I started off as an engineer in that integration discipline, so it was never about sort of detail, it was always about aggregation of the whole. Once you start to weave in programmatic responsibilities, certainly by the time you're running a business with several thousand people in it, spanning the MOD, the RAF and BAE systems, you're not really an engineer anymore. What I carry though is that belief that the right system, the right process and the right people brought together, facilitated the right way, are going to deliver an optimum outcome. You can get them there. And I remember, it was a big step for me personally in my career to move into running what was essentially a business unit, looking after the Tornado aircraft. And I just conceived of it as an engineering challenge. We're pulling together different disciplines to do that job. What the MBA, I went to do an MBA whilst working for hybrid air vehicles, while working on Airlander. And for me, that kind of put the system around that. So I recognise now that I was doing the business side of my roles were very intuitively delivered. I would say, I can be a bit more systematic now. I can draw on the theory. I can draw on some examples of practice, and that kind of speaks to the engineer in me. Like, I've got a system. I've got a taxonomy. I know how to use it. That's okay. But the the intuitive bit needs to still be there, right? That's where innovation comes from, those leaps, those things you don't find in a book. You need that intuitive bit to live with you a little bit as well. So I'm trying to balance both. Very good.
And without, digging into the fundamental error in your thinking which led you to not come to London Business School for your MBA, has the MBA changed the way that you lead?
It's certainly made me much more mindful of the way that I lead. Again, it's the difference between believing that it's right to wear your heart on the sleeve, be who you are and lead in the way that feels right to you, versus actually understanding the inherent difference in everybody, and finding the ways that speak to each individual and help each individual through so that everybody can contribute to their best. I wouldn't have, honestly, I'd have known it was the right thing to do, but I wouldn't know how to do it. So I think in terms of leadership practice, that understanding of the different threads that you can pull on, but most of all, it's the humility to know that your way isn't always the right way, is it?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just open it up to the floor for if there's any questions to be had.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. So, regarding the Airlander, how safe and reliable do you feel it is?
I'll be on board. My friends and family will be on board. We're putting 100 passengers at a time on board. It is as safe and reliable as any other aircraft that enters into service. And the underlying that, we're a highly regulated industry, right? My business is one of very few businesses in the whole of Europe that are approved by regulators to design multi-engined aircraft for passenger transport. That's a big hurdle you've got to get through before you even start. Our product itself, the aircraft itself, has got some huge advantages, right, in terms of the way it's configured, in terms of the way those different forms of lift work with each other, which means that when we're looking at the hazards that an aircraft can be exposed to, the hazard level is actually a little bit lower for an aircraft like this than it is for other aircraft. So let me give you an example of 4 engines. You can actually fly this aeroplane on any one of them. We designed for loads of 4 times the force of gravity because of the speed that the aircraft goes at, whereas a lot of other aircraft are generally stressed to 16 times the force of gravity because of the speed they go at. So these are ways in which we can move our way through testing and certifying the aircraft to show that it's safe, but the regulation that we work under is exactly the same as for everybody else in terms of the level of safety that needs to be delivered with an aircraft like this.
Great.
The thing is, regarding passengers, passengers are lighter than the goods if you need to carry. So, how much weight can it carry?
The first aircraft, the first type, the one that's going to come off the production line in Doncaster, will carry 100 passengers and their bags and equipment, or it will carry around about 10 tons of freight. And those two things are broadly equivalent to each other. Okay. There is a difference. You probably won't be aware that when we load existing aircraft up, they tend to run out of space before they run out of weight carrying capacity. So it's sometimes quite hard to get enough freight into an aircraft to carry its maximum tonnage because it would spill out over the sides, and that's not a good look for an aircraft, right? So in our aircraft, it's the other way around. So we, just because of the physics of the way it works, it's not actually because we're nice people, it's because of the physics of the way the platform works. It means we've got more space for each kilogram of mass that you can put on board the aeroplane. That means in freight we can carry larger and more outsized loads, so we can do some of the things other aircraft can't. For passengers it's really good because it means that we can't squeeze you in 3 abreast with a seat there in front of you. It just doesn't work, right? So you're going to get more space because of the type of airplane it is. If I just talk about the market, because it's very relevant to your point about freight. If I look back, I think when I look back in 20 years' time on what we've done, we will have grown a product line that is doing probably 2/3 of its work in freight and logistics transport around the world, in parts of the world and between parts of the world. The reason I think that, it goes back to that chart I had with the gap in it between the 2 different forms of transport. Put an aircraft in that gap, and its price for the operator sits between the price of surface freight and the price of air freight. Only 1% of the world's freight goes by air right now. I'd like the next percent, please. And that's a big market. Yeah. Getting to that market requires more scale. So bigger aeroplanes run at lower cost per ton kilometre. That's how we access those markets. So that's why our business plan scales from an entry product, which is it's a very big minimum proposition, but it's about the minimum proposition. And then we scale up into those bigger aircraft with big freight rolls.
Okay, thanks. And did you have a question?
You touched briefly on your type and class classification. Could you expand upon that, comparing yourself where the market is now, your competitors, and where you're aiming for?
So do you mean type and class categorization in a regulatory sense?
In a regulatory sense, so we understand the broader picture.
Yeah. Okay, so where do I start with that? We are, current landscape, you've got broadly fixed wing and rotary wing. Pretty much everybody, if you think about it from a pilot's perspective, pretty much everybody starts off fixed wing, gets basic training, then they start to specialise, and you end up with the type rating on the individual type of aircraft. So then from a certification perspective, lighter than air actually sits as its own class. So we don't see many of them around. We've got fixed wing, rotary wing, and lighter than air classes. So much as a pilot comes through, they'll go either down a fixed wing route or a rotary wing route. Of course, they can swap over later on. Same thing here. It's a different class. From a certification perspective, that also means it's got its own certification spec. So we have something called a certification spec for aircraft incorporating gas It's called SC gas at the moment. It's a special condition, which is the way certification codes start out. And that defines effectively what the type rated version, all the requirements that needs to meet. It's different to anything else that we've got. It draws on history of airship certification. There have been a few. And always certified to a very consistent set of rules, actually. And it draws on CS23 principally from passenger fixed wing aviation to create that certification spec. Now that's published, and so we know what we're doing. Let's have a look at what's going on in other parts of the landscape. I come from UAV development world. Part of my background, I was in at the early stages of some of that work. We were putting regulations onto blank pieces of a map. We haven't had to do that here because we've got all the bits of regulation around us that needed to be aggregated together. So there's really nothing in there that hasn't been done before. It's just a novel or a new combination of different bits of regulation. And I think I'm right in saying that eVTOL air taxi is right at the start, really, of that journey of getting that regulation in place. So I feel like we're well prepared now. We've got the company approved, we've got the certification basis approved, we know where it sits in the regulatory landscape, we broadly know how training is going to be viewed in that pipeline of pilot training that we see all around us. So the risk points that were there when we started, we've steadily knocked them all down.
Thank you for your presentation. I was initially going to ask a question on the sort of what market you're going for in terms of people carrying, whether it was sort of the more affluent, as that picture might denote, or do you think you can go straight to sort of commercial? But I suppose the segue is also, would it be easier and more profitable to focus on freight? I wonder where your thinking is on those markets.
Really, really good question, and questions that we spent a lot of time deliberating as we went through development of Airlander 10, and it was as fundamental as do you do it or do you go to a bigger aeroplane, actually. So which way around should I do this? Let's start with freight, shall we? So to my mind, as I've said, I think freight and logistics is the biggest market that this will end up getting into, but it does require scale. And that's because it's a price-sensitive market. It will just, in our view, it will just respond to the price. The freight doesn't care. All the freight forwarder cares about is it arrives on at a time at a price. So to attack that market head on, you need to be big enough and you need to be clear enough that all of your cost projections are going to work and get you into that space, not perfectly, but near enough. The biggest of those two issues is scale. So every time you scale up a little bit here, you've got bigger facilities to build, you've got more materials to put into the aircraft, you're increasing the capital intensity of the initial project, and you're doing it in this landscape where a lot of the de-risking capital that's around for R&D starts to drop away. Now we've got several of our competitors in the traditional lighter than air airship world are trying to do just that. We've got some advantages here. Because we put two forms of lift into each square foot, we've got aerodynamic and aerostatic lift, we can make a smaller aircraft do the same job. That reduces the capital cost at each point in our growth cycle compared to an airship. And what that means is that we can address some markets that are really difficult to address with a traditional airship right from the start. So we've started with passenger transport, surveillance, military operations, and also some luxury travel. That's a great sort of starter market there, a bit less price sensitive, bit of a demand for unique experiences. We've started there because we can build a business that can scale from there, and we can do it with lower capital cost and lower risk. That's why we started from there. On your point about passenger travel, I personally don't think, and I don't think the stats and the surveys bear out the idea that passengers are actually willing to pay a big green premium for their flights. I actually don't think they're willing to pay much for time premium either. We're seeing people move to railways a bit, but the convenience of a flight is a convenience of a flight. So with Air Nostrum, for example, to get to where we've got to, we've had to go through, it's hard work running an airline. So the costs have got to be right for the airline, they've got to be right for the passenger, and you've got to get the emissions down. Oh, and by the way, you've got to deliver the right number of revenue passenger kilometres, get passengers to their destination within a reasonable boundary of time compared to today's jets. So we've had to do all that. Now you can do that with our aeroplane on a European sector, right? 370 kilometres is the median regional jet route in Europe. So we can get all of that right for that in a way that we wouldn't try to get right at the moment for London to New York, for example.
Just wondering how this will fit in with the current infrastructure. In other words, are you going to be able to deal with existing airports in terms of the size of your vehicle, how it fits into the aprons or the air bridges, etc.? And what sort of length of landing time, length of land strip you need, and also landing time. In other words, can you fit into the current airport time slots of big airports like Gatwick or Heathrow, or can you actually manage to land in a much shorter airport? Therefore, you could go from an airport close to where goods are wanted, where you can land on a short strip, while still take off or land in Heathrow as a base, or not necessarily Heathrow, whichever big airport you go for.
Okay, great question. So it really comes down to the use case. So we're designing the aeroplane to be able to interoperate with air traffic and with today's air traffic management. But it is as different to the airliner that's taking off from Heathrow as a helicopter is to that airliner. So can a helicopter fly into Heathrow? Yes. Yeah. Does it fly in and land on the same runway? No. Does the business case for helicopter use rely on being able to get into and out of Heathrow? Generally not. So I think about it in those terms, and then the examples. So it can do, but the question is, would you do? The best example is what we're doing in Scotland, where there's quite a network of small airports over the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, but they are small. They're capable of taking in, anything from sort of 6-seater aircraft up to maybe 10 or a few more, but nothing really big. Our aircraft takes off and lands in 6 times its own length, so that's 600 metres. It does it in a slightly different way. It doesn't need a runway. It just needs a flat space. And interestingly enough, it can do it from water as well, which is really neat, and that's quite interesting to a lot of our customers. Yeah. And what we've done in Scotland is we've worked with Highlands and Islands Airports Limited, Hightrans, the Scottish Agency for Transport, AECOM, infrastructure services firm, and others to look at what you'd need to do to that infrastructure to get Airlander operating. And the answer is it's about £200,000 an airport to make them Airlander ready. So very little. And what they get for that is an airstrip that at the moment can carry 6 passengers in and out, can suddenly get a 10-ton freight delivery for that island, or can get 60 passengers and 4 tons of freight in and out, or whatever variant on that you want. That's a game changer. So it's those sort of operations that we see as being key. And you just probably, for practical reasons, won't see this coming into and out of Heathrow.
But maybe into airports in Glasgow then?
Quite possibly, yeah.
Right. Well, we're out of time, but if you want to have one next question.
Just a quick question about the finances and the funding. And
yeah.
I think you mentioned a little bit at the beginning, but I am not sure if you can give a little more detail about what you have been funding so far and what are your funding needs and how they're going to be used.
Yeah, so we've developed Airlander with about £130 million of development money so far. I say we've developed Airlander, we've actually built a company, we've built everything that goes around it, we've gone through those regulatory processes. They're much more holistic than just putting it all into the product, but that's what it's taken to get here. About half of that, a little over half of that, has come from customers in one form or another, so it's been revenue. The rest, we've had some grant funding, and then we've got a broad set of shareholders, investors who've been patient investors with us, typically private individuals, high net worth individuals, family offices, those sort of investors that have been with us on this journey. Really interesting inflection point now from a business perspective, in that scaling up into facilities, scaling up to 3 aircraft, have 24 aircraft production capacity, all of those things, that's much more capital intensive. So we're working there with institutional finance, also with strategic partners, the sort of partners that would find paths to market for their own products through this, or sovereign wealth funds. That's the sort of the pool of investors for the next stage. The other part of that goes back to what I was talking about, policy. I think these are strategic projects. Aerospace projects are strategic. They're important for place, and so public investment becomes important to help crowd in those other sources of money. And that's where South Yorkshire, the Mayor Coppard has put a £7 million loan aside to go into this project. We've also had an ongoing conversation with government about how they might, UK government, about how they might participate in that. So these are the things that I've learned you need to get through that scale-up funding piece, and we're making good progress on that.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much, Tom. That's been fantastic, and could we all thank Tom for his time? Thank you very much for joining us on that conversation. We hope that you enjoyed it. We hope that you learned something. If you did enjoy it, please feel free to leave a 5-star review and to subscribe to any of our channels, and we'll be sure to keep you updated on future productions. These are conversations that you just can't afford to miss.